The air conditioning in the law offices of Gregson and Vance hummed with a low, expensive vibration. The room smelled of ozone, fresh ink, and the sharp citrus cologne my older brother, Julian, always wore. I sat on one side of a massive mahogany conference table. My parents, Richard and Helen, sat on the other side, flanking Julian like bodyguards protecting a king. They wore clothes meant for a country club luncheon, not a meeting about a man who had been put in the ground just 3 weeks prior. Julian was busy checking his phone, his thumb flicking across the screen, utterly bored by the proceedings. Attorney Gregson, a man who had handled everything from local corporate mergers to my aunt's vicious divorce a decade ago, slid a single sheet of heavy bond paper across the polished wood. It was a copy of a will my grandfather had drafted 15 years ago. I stared at the document. The words blurred together, but the bottom line was crystal clear. It left the entirety of his assets, the sprawling 800 acres of prime Iowa farmland, the massive white farmhouse, the heavy machinery, and the vintage Porsche 911 my grandfather had restored with his own hands, to his only son, my father. And my father, in turn, was immediately transferring the bulk of that estate directly into a trust controlled by Julian. I did not look at the paper. I looked at my father. I asked him, my voice tight, about the will Grandpa had drafted just 6 months ago. The one we had talked about on the front porch. The one where he left the acreage to me because he knew I was the only one who would actually farm it, the only one who understood soil analytics and crop rotation. My father sighed. He removed his reading glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. He adopted the exact tone of a tired parent explaining a basic concept to a slow child. Carter, your grandfather was confused at the end, my father said. You know, we had his doctor review his medical history. The minor stroke he suffered 2 years ago caused cognitive decline. Gregson filed the medical injunction last week. The new will is invalid. We are reverting to the established document to secure the family portfolio. Securing the family portfolio. That was my father's sterile phrase for liquidating generational blood and sweat into hard cash. My mother, Helen, adjusted her designer scarf. She didn't even look at me. Carter, please do not start with your environmental speeches. Your father and I have carried the financial burden of this family for decades. Julian is ready to manage the estate's transition. It is time we prioritize our retirement. You are an adult. You can figure out your own path. I kept my voice level, though my hands were shaking under the table. I asked my father if he was going to sell to Agrier Solutions, the massive agricultural conglomerate that had been buying up independent farms and turning them into chemical wastelands. Julian finally looked up from his phone. He let out a short, mocking laugh. Don't worry about the corporate side of things, little brother. Let the adults handle the real estate. Gregson cleared his throat, effectively cutting off the argument. He handed me a thin, manila envelope. Your grandfather did carve out a small provision for you 15 years ago. It remains intact. You retain ownership of the 2 acres bordering the Mud Creek Basin, including the structure on the property. The structure was a hunting cabin that had not been used since the late 90s. The land around it was rocky, prone to flooding, and completely useless for planting. It was the only part of the estate the corporate buyers would never want. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single, rusted brass key. My father put his glasses back on. He told me I had until Friday to collect any personal items from the main farmhouse before the staging company arrived to prepare it for the estate sale. He told me to leave my key to the main house on the kitchen counter. There was no anger in his voice. There was no malice. There was only business. That was the part that hurt the most. I was not a son grieving a grandfather. I was an administrative hurdle they had successfully cleared. We walked out of the office together. In the parking garage, my parents got into a leased silver sedan. Julian walked over to the vintage Porsche 911. My grandfather's pride and joy, and unlocked it with a sharp chirp. He slid into the driver's seat, revved the engine, and didn't even glance in my direction as he sped out of the garage. I walked over to my 10-year-old truck, tossed my 2 duffel bags into the passenger seat, and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I drove an hour east, leaving the concrete of the city for the sprawling open skies of rural Iowa. I didn't drive up the main driveway toward the large white farmhouse. I belonged nowhere near it now. Instead, I took the dirt access path that wound through the treeline toward Mud Creek. The trees parted, revealing my inheritance. The cabin was worse than I remembered. The dark wood siding was gray and rotting at the base. The front steps sagged under a thick layer of wet autumn leaves. There was no plumbing, only an old hand pump well in the yard, and a generator around back that hadn't held fuel in a decade. I unlocked the front door. The hinges screamed. The air inside smelled of dust, old pine, and stagnant water. A faded plaid sofa sat in the center of the room. A wood-burning stove stood in the corner. On the far wall hung a heavy, rectangular mirror with a tarnished silver frame. The glass was cloudy and warped by years of humidity. I dropped my bags on the floorboards. The sound echoed in the empty room. I sat on the edge of the sofa and looked around. The cold wind pushed through the gaps in the window frames, biting at my neck. The reality of my situation settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. My grandfather was gone. My childhood home was being prepped for a corporate sale. My parents had legally erased me. I stared at the cloudy mirror on the wall, seeing only a distorted reflection of a man sitting in a rotting room. A deep, hot anger began to build in my chest. It was a suffocating, blinding frustration. I told myself I would not let them get away with it. But I had nothing. 7 nights later, the Iowa weather broke. A severe autumn storm rolled across the plains, bringing a punishing mix of freezing rain, sleet, and howling wind that rattled the timber framing. The cabin groaned under the sustained pressure. I sat near the iron stove, trying to ignore the bitter draft cutting through the floorboards. Around midnight, a steady dripping sound echoed from the far wall. Water was breaching the compromised roof shingles, sliding down the interior pine panels directly behind the heavy antique mirror. If I left the mirror there, the creeping moisture would ruin the silver backing and warp the wooden frame beyond repair. It was one of the few items in the room that actually belonged to my grandfather, and I was not going to let it rot. I dragged a wooden dining chair over to the wall, stepped up, and gripped the carved edges of the frame. The mirror weighed far more than I anticipated. I braced my work boots against the chair seat and pulled upward. My wet boots slipped. I lost my balance. The mirror crashed to the floor, the glass shattering into jagged pieces across the faded rug. I knelt down, checking my palms for cuts, cursing my own clumsiness in the dark. But when I looked back up at the exposed wall, my breath caught in my throat. I froze. The area where the mirror had hung for decades was not solid pine. Someone had cut a neat rectangular square out of the paneling. Inside the dark, hollowed-out cavity sat a gray metal lockbox. I reached into the cold recess and pulled the box free. It was heavy, sealed with a simple combination dial. My grandfather was a creature of habit, a man who anchored his life to specific dates. I rolled the brass dials to the month and year my grandmother passed away. The latch clicked open with a sharp metallic snap. Inside the box lay a thick stack of folded papers and a single white envelope. Written across the front of the envelope in black ink, in a familiar jagged script, were the words, "Open this after I am gone." My hands trembled slightly as I broke the paper seal. I pulled out a dense, typed legal document and a handwritten letter clipped to the front page. I sat on the floor amid the broken glass and read my grandfather's final message by the light of a battery-powered lantern. What I read in those pages didn't just change my life. It armed me with a weapon so devastating, my family wouldn't even see the blast coming. To understand why my family discarded me so easily, you have to understand the dynamic that governed our house since I was a child. Julian was the golden child. It wasn't a subtle preference. It was a structural reality of our family. When it was time for higher education, my parents emptied a massive college fund to send Julian to a prestigious out-of-state business school. He joined a fraternity, networked with wealthy heirs, and graduated with a degree in corporate consulting. When I graduated high school, my father handed me a brochure for the local community college and suggested I look into student loans. I paid my own way, working late shifts at a hardware store to cover my tuition while studying agricultural soil analytics. When Julian turned 25, my grandfather allowed him to drive the vintage Porsche 911 on weekends. Julian treated it like a prop for his social media. When I spent my summers walking the 800 acres with Grandpa, learning how to test pH levels and rotate crops to keep the topsoil alive, my parents complained about the smell of fertilizer on my boots. At Grandpa's funeral, the contrast was sickening. Julian stood by the casket in a tailored suit, shaking hands with local politicians and corporate executives, treating the memorial service like a networking event. My parents stood beside him, playing the role of the grieving, dignified patriarchs. I stood in the back row, invisible. The day after I found the lockbox, I made a massive mistake. I let my anger dictate my strategy. I didn't fully comprehend the documents I had found yet. I only knew I wanted to hit back. I took the meager salary I had saved up over 3 years, about $15,000, and drove into town to hire a lawyer. I didn't know anyone high profile, so I hired a discount estate attorney named Davis who operated out of a strip mall. He took my money, nodded enthusiastically, and promised he could challenge the medical injunction my parents had used to invalidate the new will. 2 weeks later, the hearing took place. It was a slaughter. Attorney Gregson, representing my parents, arrived looking completely unbothered. Davis, sweating through his cheap suit, fumbled his words and cited the wrong state statutes. The judge presiding over the case was Judge Harrison. I knew him. He played golf with my father every Sunday. Judge Harrison didn't even let Davis finish his argument. He granted Gregson a summary dismissal based on a lack of compelling evidence in under 10 minutes. He struck down the contest, finalized the probate ruling, and closed the file. My entire life savings evaporated into thin air. I stood alone in the courthouse hallway. My phone buzzed. It was my father. I answered, bracing for a gloating speech. Instead, his voice was calm, measured, and utterly patronizing. "Carter, please stop embarrassing yourself," Richard said. "You hired a strip mall novice to waste the court's time. You are being too emotional. Agrier Solutions is offering a premium buyout. Your grandfather would have wanted us to be comfortable, not chained to a tractor. You need to grow up and let the adults handle reality." He disconnected the call. He truly believed he was the responsible pragmatist, and I was just a naive child throwing a tantrum. I drove back to the cabin, defeated, broke, and freezing. I sat on the faded sofa and pulled out my grandfather's letter again. I had been too angry to process it before. Now, with nothing left, I read it carefully. My grandfather wrote that he knew his health was failing. He knew Richard viewed the acreage as a liquid asset and would court a corporate buyer the moment the funeral concluded. My grandfather despised the industrial farming conglomerates. He knew they would pump the ground full of synthetic fertilizers and drain the local aquifer dry. He knew he couldn't simply write my parents out of the primary will without triggering a drawn-out legal battle. So, 3 years prior, while his medical record still showed perfect cognitive health, he laid a quiet, brilliant trap. He legally severed the primary irrigation rights and the central geographical access easement from the main property deed. He transferred those crucial structural components into a blind holding company. The main farm still looked whole on paper to a casual observer, but structurally it was gutted. The 800 acres of prime soil meant nothing if a buyer could not legally pump water from the river or drive their heavy combine harvesters down the central dirt access road. The letter concluded with a simple instruction. The rusted brass key I received at the probate office did not belong to the cabin door. It belonged to a safe deposit box at the independent community bank in town. That box held the original operating agreement of the holding company. And my grandfather had named me the sole managing director. I lowered the letter. The freezing temperature in the room vanished. I didn't inherit a worthless strip of flooded land. I inherited the legal chokehold over the entire agricultural empire. Without my signature, Agrier Solutions could not irrigate a single acre. The multimillion-dollar deal my parents were negotiating was built on a foundation of sand. The next morning, I went to the bank, used the rusted key, and retrieved the operating agreement. I drove straight to the county clerk's office to register my status and lock the claim into public record. I walked up to the counter and handed the documents to Brenda, a clerk who had worked there for 20 years. She adjusted her glasses, typed the registration numbers into her terminal, and frowned. She looked up at me with an expression that bordered on pity. "Carter," Brenda said softly, "because your grandfather kept this entity dormant for 3 years to hide it, the holding company is flagged as inactive by the State Revenue Board." I asked her what that meant. She spun the monitor around. To activate a dormant commercial entity, you have to bring the account into compliance. The holding company owes 3 years of back taxes on the water rights, plus late penalties. The total balance to activate your claim is $4,800. Cold knot formed in my stomach. I opened my wallet. I had $32 in cash, and my bank account was at zero after paying that useless lawyer. I begged Brenda for a payment plan. She shook her head. The fees had to be paid in full via certified check. I had the weapon to stop my parents, but I couldn't afford the ammunition to fire it. I walked out of the municipal building. Before I reached my truck, a sheriff's deputy stepped into my path and handed me a manila envelope. I tore it open. It was a temporary injunction filed against the holding company, citing a pending review regarding the operational status of the water rights. The signature at the bottom belonged to Judge Harrison. My father had already realized his vulnerability. He had utilized his local connections to freeze my legal maneuvering before I even knew the game had started. He bought himself time to corner me. I needed money, and I needed it fast. My career as a soil analyst was irrelevant in a town that only hired scientists to work for the corporations I was fighting. I drove to a local diner situated near the interstate highway. The interior smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. I walked up to the manager and asked for a job. He looked at my muddy boots, handed me an apron, and told me the evening shift started at 4. That night, I traded my soil testing equipment for a stained notepad. I served meatloaf to truck drivers. I wiped spilled ketchup off sticky vinyl booths. My feet ached, my back throbbed, and the tips amounted to spare change. It was grueling, humiliating work. But every dollar I shoved into my apron pocket brought me closer to the $4,800 I needed. I thought I was operating under the radar. I underestimated how closely my family monitored their liabilities. By my second week working the evening shift, the physical exhaustion became a permanent ache in my lower spine. I kept my head down, focusing only on the jar of tip money slowly growing in my truck's glove compartment. On a rainy Tuesday night, the bell above the diner's glass entry door chimed. I stood behind the laminate counter, unscrewing the lids of glass salt shakers. I looked up and my blood ran cold. My parents and Julian walked into the dining room. The visual disconnect was jarring. Helen wore a beige cashmere coat. Richard wore a tailored charcoal jacket. Julian had the collar of his designer trench coat popped against the rain. They stood in the entryway looking at the scuffed linoleum floor and the flickering neon beer signs as if they had stepped into a sewer. Julian spotted me behind the counter. A cruel, triumphant smirk spread across his face. He nudged my father and pointed. I set down the salt shaker. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. I grabbed a fresh pot of coffee, picked up 3 porcelain mugs, and walked over to the corner booth they had claimed. I set the mugs down on the scratched formica surface. "Cream or sugar?" I asked, my voice deadpan. My mother looked at my stained uniform apron. She reached out and placed her manicured hand over my calloused fingers. "Carter, please sit down. This has gone far enough. We are worried about you." I pulled my hand away. "I'm working a shift. Do you want coffee or not?" Richard waved his hand dismissively. He folded his arms on the table. "We didn't come for diner food. We came because people in town are talking." They see you working here, living in that drafty shack. Julian leaned back in the booth, crossing his arms. It's pathetic, Carter. Truly. You're embarrassing the family name pouring cheap coffee. Helen unclasped her leather handbag. She pulled out a crisp white envelope and slid it across the sticky table. We want to help you get back on your feet. You don't have to suffer to prove a point. I picked up the envelope and opened the flap. Inside was a certified cashier's check made out to my name. The amount printed on the center line was $25,000. For a waitress or a broke soil analyst surviving on pocket change, $25,000 is a life-altering sum. It was a warm apartment, a reliable vehicle, security. I looked up from the check. I knew my parents didn't hand out charity without securing a return on their investment. What does this cost? I asked. Richard gave a tight, practiced smile. He reached into his jacket and retrieved a single sheet of legal paper. He slid it next to the check. Standard administrative formality. Agrier Solutions requires clean geographic borders for their zoning permits. It's a quitclaim deed. You surrender all rights, titles, and attached easements regarding the riverfront parcel back to the primary estate. They didn't mention the holding company. They didn't say a word about the water rights. They played the role of concerned parents attempting to rescue a stubborn child. I stared at the quitclaim deed. $25,000 was a fraction of a percent of the $4.5 million they stood to gain by selling out my grandfather's legacy to an industrial machine. I picked up the cashier's check, slid it back into the white envelope, placed the envelope on top of the quitclaim deed, and pushed both documents back across the table. The land is not for sale, I said. The illusion of parental concern evaporated instantly. Richard leaned forward, bridging the space between us, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You think you are playing a clever game, Carter? You think holding that worthless plot of dirt gives you leverage? Let me explain how the real world operates. He tapped his index finger against the table. That cabin has exposed electrical wiring, a failing roof, and no modern septic tank. I had a very long conversation with the county building inspector this morning. I am offering you a graceful exit. If you refuse, the inspector will visit the riverfront property on Friday morning. The county will cite the structure for severe health and safety violations. They will condemn the cabin as unfit for human habitation. The municipal board will seize the property under an emergency public safety mandate. You will lose the land, you will lose your little holding company, and you will be sleeping in your truck by the weekend. Helen looked down at her lap, allowing the threat to stand. Julian just smirked, picking up a sugar packet and tossing it onto the quitclaim deed. Sign the paper, Carter. Don't be an idiot. You have until Thursday evening to sign the paper and drop it off at Gregson's office, Richard said. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and escorted Helen out the door. Julian followed, shooting me one last look of utter disgust. I stood alone in the diner holding the glass coffee pot. They were willing to render their own son homeless to close a corporate real estate transaction. I needed to go on the offensive, and I couldn't do it alone. When my shift ended at 2 a.m., I walked out to the dark parking lot. A sleek black SUV was idling near the dumpster. The driver's side window rolled down. It was Luke, a local real estate broker who frequently ate at the diner. Over the past week, I had vented to him a few times while pouring his coffee, thinking he was just a friendly local who hated corporate buyouts as much as I did. Rough night, Carter? Luke asked, taking a drag from a cigarette. I stopped. I remembered seeing a similar SUV parked outside Gregson's law firm a few days ago. The pieces clicked together. How did my father know I was working here, Luke? I haven't told anyone in town my schedule. Luke exhaled a plume of smoke, looking entirely unapologetic. Your brother Julian pays very well for information. $1,000 just to tell him where you were slinging hash. Nothing personal, kid. It's just business. He rolled up his window and drove off into the rain. The betrayal stung, but it crystallized my resolve. There were no good guys left in this town. The next morning, I skipped sleep and drove into town. I walked up 3 flights of stairs in a fading brick office building to the office of Gabriel Vance, an agricultural and property attorney. Gabriel was not a polished corporate lawyer. He was in his late 50s, had a reputation for being abrasive, unsentimental, and brutally effective against eminent domain seizures. I walked into his office without an appointment. His desk was a mountain of files. "Not taking new clients. Close the door on your way out," he grunted without looking up. I ignored him. I walked to his desk, pulled the original holding company operating agreement from my jacket, and slapped it down on top of his files. I told him my name. I told him I owned the foundational water rights to an 800-acre tract under a $4.5 million corporate buyout from Agrier Solutions. I told him about the injunction, the tax debt, and my father's threat to send a building inspector on Friday. Gabriel stopped reading. He looked at the paperwork, then at me. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the rustle of turning pages. When he finished, a razor-sharp smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Brilliant trap," Gabriel muttered. "But you're delusional if you think you can save the whole farm out of spite. If you want to survive, you stop acting like a wounded son and start acting like a corporate adversary." Gabriel offered me a harsh deal. He would take the case on contingency, meaning I wouldn't have to pay him upfront, solving my financial crisis, but he demanded absolute strategic control. We weren't going to fight to save the farm. We were going to fight to destroy the Agrier buyout entirely and force a negotiated surrender. I agreed. We spent 4 hours mapping out a counteroffensive. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, a silver sedan was parked in the dirt driveway. Samantha, my fiancée, was standing on the sagging porch. We had been together for 3 years. She worked in public relations in Des Moines. She appreciated predictable schedules, warm apartments, and logical decisions. We hadn't spoken since the probate disaster. I felt a surge of relief. I thought she had come to support me. I walked up the steps, reaching out to hug her. She stepped back. She didn't meet my eyes. She reached into her purse, pulled out the velvet box containing the engagement ring I had given her, and set it on the porch railing. "Sam, what is this?" I asked, the air leaving my lungs. "I can't do this, Carter," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Julian called me yesterday. He offered me the position of VP of Communications at his consulting firm. It's a 6-figure salary, Carter. It's the promotion I've been working for my entire life." I stared at her, uncomprehending. "Julian offered you a job? Why?" Samantha finally looked up, her eyes hard. "With the condition that I come down here and convince you to sign the quitclaim deed. He said if you sign it, the job is mine. If you don't, he blacklists me from every major firm in the Midwest. Carter, you are sleeping in a shack without heat to prove a point to a dead man. I'm not throwing away my career for your vendetta." She turned around, got into her car, and drove away. I stood on the porch, staring at the velvet box. The final tether to my humanity, to my capacity for trust, snapped. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over me. On Friday morning, a county building inspector arrived in a white municipal truck. He walked the perimeter of the cabin, photographing the rotting foundation. He didn't speak a word to me. When he finished, he peeled a strip of bright red industrial tape across my front door. It was a 14-day eviction notice. The condemnation process had officially begun. The storm had arrived, and I was standing right in the center of it. Tuesday night arrived with a biting wind that rattled the windows of the municipal town hall. The public hearing to formally challenge my eviction took place in a multi-purpose gymnasium that smelled of floor wax and wet wool. The zoning board consisted of 5 local figures: a hardware store owner, a retired bank manager, an insurance broker, a high school principal, and the mayor. These were men and women who watched the town's budget shrink every year as independent farms went bankrupt. I sat next to Gabriel in the second row. My parents and Julian sat near the front. They looked like pillars of the community. When the agenda reached the riverfront parcel, the board chairman invited public comment. My father stood up, adjusted his tweed blazer, and walked to the podium. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the measured, soothing cadence of a civic leader addressing a difficult community hardship. He pitched the Agrier Solutions buyout as an economic lifeline, a $4.5 million injection into the local economy that would fund the fire department and provide steady employment. The board members leaned forward, nodding in agreement. Having secured their financial interest, my father pivoted his crosshairs to me. His expression softened into a mask of profound paternal sorrow. "My father's death was a devastating blow to our family," Richard told the microphone. "Carter is struggling to process the grief. He is clinging to a piece of condemned dirt because he thinks it will keep his grandfather alive. We have tried to get him help. We offered him a substantial financial gift to relocate to a safe environment. He refused. I asked the board to proceed with the condemnation not to punish my son, but to protect him from his own irrationality, and to allow this town to move forward." A low murmur of sympathetic agreement rippled through the folding chairs. The residents cast side glances at me, filled with pity and judgment. Julian turned in his seat and gave me a barely perceptible, mocking salute. Gabriel stood up and approached the podium armed with property statutes. He argued that the county was overstepping its eminent domain authority to facilitate a private corporate transaction. His arguments were legally flawless, but the room had already rendered a verdict. Law meant nothing against the promise of a multimillion-dollar tax base. The board chairman cut Gabriel off mid-sentence, struck his wooden gavel, and upheld the 14-day eviction notice. My parents walked up the aisle, accepting sympathetic handshakes. Julian purposely bumped my shoulder as he passed. "Tick-tock, Carter. Start packing your bags." I walked out into the freezing parking lot, the sting of public humiliation burning in my throat. Gabriel walked beside me, lighting a cigar. "The legal defense failed because we fought a social war with property statutes," Gabriel said, blowing smoke into the wind. "We can't win a popularity contest against an opponent offering a financial bailout. We need a different kind of ammunition. We need a threat that scares the town more than poverty does." I drove back to the red-tagged cabin. The wind howled through the gaps in the timber. I had fewer than 12 days before the sheriff arrived with padlocks. I sat on the faded sofa and looked at the metal lockbox resting on the floorboards. I pulled out my grandfather's letter and read the jagged handwriting again. I realized something crucial was missing from the equation. My grandfather was a quiet man, but he was not vindictive. He would not have established a complex holding company solely to inconvenience my father. There had to be a structural reason he wanted to stop Agrier from touching the soil. I walked over to the wooden crate where I had stacked his old farming journals and leather-bound ledgers. If I couldn't beat my father with public sympathy, I had to figure out why this specific corporate buyout terrified a man who had spent 70 years managing the dirt. I spent the weekend dismantling my grandfather's life. I sorted through the paper mountain hour after hour. On Sunday afternoon, I found a black leather ledger wedged at the bottom of a plastic storage bin. The pages were filled with typed correspondence between my grandfather and an independent hydrology firm based in Illinois, dated 4 years ago, right around the time Agrier Solutions first began purchasing independent farms in the neighboring counties. Tucked into the back of the ledger was the final hydrology report. It was a 40-page technical document filled with soil density graphs and subterranean mapping. I am a soil analyst. I know how to read these charts. As I scanned the conclusion of the report, the blood drained from my face. The 800 acres of our family farm sat directly above a shallow, highly permeable section of the regional aquifer. This subterranean reservoir supplied the drinking water for our town and 3 surrounding municipalities. Agrier Solutions utilized deep-tilling machines that destroyed the natural filtration layer of the topsoil. They saturated the dirt with highly concentrated synthetic nitrogen fertilizers and industrial pesticides. The hydrologist calculated the contamination timeline with clinical precision. Given the shallow depth of the aquifer beneath our specific acreage, the heavy chemical runoff from a corporate operation would breach the groundwater supply within exactly 7.4 years. If Agrier bought the farm, they would effectively poison the drinking water for 20,000 people. The contamination would be irreversible. My grandfather didn't sever the water rights out of spite. He built the trap to protect the town. He knew the zoning board would sell out to the highest bidder, so he created a geographic choke point that prevented the corporation from bringing their chemicals near the riverfront. I finally possessed the ammunition to destroy my father's public narrative. I drove into town early Monday morning and slammed the hydrology report onto Gabriel's desk. He read the conclusion twice. He didn't smile. He removed his glasses and rubbed his temples. "This changes the battlefield entirely," Gabriel said, "but it presents a massive logistical nightmare. This report is 4 years old and privately commissioned by a deceased landowner. If we walk into a courtroom and try to use it to block a $4 million buyout, Agrier's legal team will shred it in 10 minutes. They'll argue the data is outdated and biased. Judge Harrison will dismiss it before lunch." Gabriel leaned across his desk. "To secure an emergency environmental injunction capable of halting the municipal eviction and overriding local judges, we need fresh, undeniable proof. We need an updated, certified geological survey conducted by a recognized state authority. We need a university geology team to drill core samples, analyze the modern soil permeability, and officially confirm the contamination timeline." "How long does a state-certified survey take?" I asked. "Months," Gabriel said grimly. "Permit approvals, scheduling, laboratory analysis." I pointed to the red tag I had peeled off my door. "I have 10 days before the sheriff throws me out. Then we don't go through official academic channels," Gabriel stated. "We need a professional team willing to bypass the bureaucratic red tape, mobilize heavy drilling equipment within 48 hours, and process the soil data overnight. Finding a firm willing to do a rushed, off-the-books survey for a guy facing eviction is functionally impossible." I stood up from the chair. I knew exactly one person who possessed the technical authority, the equipment, and the state certification to execute the survey. Professor Nathan. He was my former mentor at the university, the man who had taught me everything I knew about soil analytics. He now ran the university's Advanced Environmental Mapping Division. He was a pure scientist who despised corporate corruption. But asking him meant risking his academic tenure if we were caught bypassing protocols. I sat in the cab of my truck, gripping the steering wheel. The heater struggled to push warm air against the freezing windshield. I dialed Nathan's private number. The line rang 3 times before he answered. "Carter? It's been years. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Nathan's voice was warm, a stark contrast to the coldness of my family. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed an emergency geological survey of the riverfront parcel, and I needed the core samples processed within 48 hours. Nathan let out a slow breath. "Carter, expedited commercial surveys require weeks of municipal permitting. You know this. Why are you pushing for a geological map of an estate property?" I explained the contents of my grandfather's old ledger. I detailed the holding company, the hidden water rights, and the Illinois hydrology report. I told him Agrier intended to deploy synthetic nitrogen across the entire acreage. I explained how the chemical runoff would taint the municipal drinking supply for 20,000 residents in less than 8 years. "I have the legal mechanism to stop the real estate transfer," I told him, my voice cracking slightly. "But my family has the local judges in their pocket. I lack the modern scientific data required to execute the trap at the state level. If you don't help me, they sell the land on Friday, and the aquifer dies." Nathan listened quietly. He understood the devastating ecological mathematics of industrial runoff better than anyone. A long silence stretched across the cellular connection. I could hear the gears turning in his head, weighing his career against the safety of 20,000 people. "I can utilize an academic loophole to bypass the local permitting process," Nathan finally said, his voice dropping an octave. "I can register the core extraction as an independent university research study. I will mobilize a skeleton crew. We come in under the cover of darkness. If anyone asks, it's a routine academic soil sampling. I'll run the lab analysis myself overnight. Thank you, Nathan. Don't thank me yet, he interrupted. If this data isn't bulletproof, Agriers lawyers will bury us both. Be at the cabin at 2 a.m. tomorrow. Have the access paths cleared for the drilling rig. I hung up the phone. The eviction clock was ticking down relentlessly. The bulldozers were literally staging at the county line. But for the first time since my grandfather died, I wasn't just fighting back. I was preparing to drop a nuclear bomb on the entire corporate buyout. At 2 in the morning, the Iowa wind felt like a physical assault. The temperature had plummeted well below freezing, and a brutal mix of sleet and snow whipped across the desolate riverfront. I stood on the sagging porch of the cabin, wearing every layer of clothing I owned, staring into the absolute darkness of the treeline. My breath formed thick, white clouds in the freezing air. Every muscle in my body was tight with anticipation. The 14-day eviction clock was ticking down, and the heavy machinery of Agrier Solutions was already staging less than 5 miles away. Then, 2 beams of yellow light cut through the sleet. A heavy, unmarked white commercial van crunched down the dirt access path, its tires slipping in the frozen mud. It pulled up near the riverbank, and the headlights clicked off. The driver's side door opened, and Professor Nathan stepped out into the storm. He wore a heavy high-visibility parka and thick waterproof boots. He did not look like a soft academic. He looked like a man preparing for war. 2 technicians climbed out of the back, their faces obscured by thick wool masks. They did not speak. They moved with the silent, ruthless efficiency of a military unit operating deep behind enemy lines. I walked down the porch steps to meet him. Nathan gripped my shoulder firmly, his gloved hand a solid anchor in the chaotic weather. "We do this fast, and we do it right," Nathan said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "If my department head finds out I mobilized a university rig at 2 in the morning for an off-the-books extraction on a condemned estate, I lose my tenure. Let's get the core samples before the ground freezes solid." The technicians unloaded a portable hydraulic drilling rig from the back of the van. The gasoline engine roared to life, a mechanical scream that shattered the quiet of the night. Under normal circumstances, the noise would have brought my father or Julian running down from the main farmhouse to investigate. But they were miles away, sleeping soundly in their warm beds, dreaming of the multimillion-dollar wire transfer they fully expected to hit their bank accounts by Friday afternoon. For the next 3 hours, I stood shoulder to shoulder with the technicians. The hydraulic press drove hollow steel tubes deep into the frozen earth, extracting long, cylindrical columns of soil and bedrock. The mud froze to our gloves. The sleet coated our jackets in a layer of solid ice. Nathan stood near the riverbank, holding a digital tablet wrapped in a waterproof case, logging the GPS coordinates and meticulously cataloging the soil strata. We had to be absolutely flawless. A single error in the chain of custody, a single unverified coordinate, and Agrier's army of corporate lawyers would tear the data to shreds in front of a judge. By 5 in the morning, the sky began to turn a bruised, pale gray. The technicians packed the steel tubes into padded, temperature-controlled cases, loaded the rig back into the van, and slammed the heavy doors shut. Nathan walked over to me, handing me a frozen clipboard. I signed the chain of custody forms with fingers so numb I could barely hold the pen. "I am taking these straight to the university lab," Nathan said, his breath pluming in the cold. "I will run the mass spectrometry and permeability tests myself. I will email the certified results directly to your lawyer's encrypted server the second they compile. Carter, if your grandfather's old numbers were right, you are sitting on an ecological time bomb." He climbed into the driver's seat and drove away, leaving me alone in the freezing dawn. I walked back into the drafty cabin, fed the last of my split wood into the iron stove, and waited. I did not sleep. I stared at the screen of my phone, watching the minutes tick by. At exactly 7:45 on Thursday morning, my phone buzzed. It was an email notification from Gabriel. There was no text in the body of the message, only a heavily encrypted PDF attachment. I opened the document. The official seal of the state university sat at the top of the title page. I scrolled past the dense methodology sections and the raw data tables, straight to the executive conclusion. The modern laboratory analysis verified every single calculation from my grandfather's old leather ledger. The natural filtration layer of topsoil above the aquifer was dangerously thin. The report concluded with absolute, terrifying scientific certainty. If Agrier Solutions applied their standard volume of industrial pesticides, synthetic nitrogen, and deep-tilling machinery to the 800 acres, the toxic runoff would breach the water table in exactly 7.4 years. The contamination of the municipal drinking supply serving 20,000 residents would be catastrophic and entirely irreversible. My grandfather was right. My father was not just selling his family legacy. He was selling a poison pill to his own neighbors to fund a luxury retirement in Florida. I printed a hard copy of the results, grabbed my keys, and drove my battered truck straight to Gabriel's office. I threw the certified geological report onto his desk. Gabriel read the conclusion twice. He did not smile. He operated with the cold, clinical precision of a man who had spent his career destroying corporate giants in brutal litigation. He had handled everything from vicious corporate takeovers to high-profile assets tied up in bitter divorce and custody battles. He knew exactly how to dismantle an opponent. "We have the weapon," Gabriel stated, his voice dangerously calm. "But a weapon is useless if you fire it in enemy territory. If we take this to the municipal courthouse, Judge Harrison will grant your father an administrative stay. He will bury this data under procedural delays until the sheriff throws you off the property and the corporate transfer clears." Gabriel stood up and grabbed his heavy wool coat. "We bypass the local corruption entirely. We are taking the battlefield out of your father's jurisdiction. We are escalating this war to a level he cannot control. We spent the entire day drafting a specialized legal instrument known as an Emergency Environmental Protection Injunction. We mapped the exact GPS coordinates of the corporate access roads directly over the shallowest points of the subterranean aquifer. We structured the petition so the state would place a hard, non-negotiable freeze on the entire 800 acres. Gabriel did not mail the petition. He drove it directly to the Department of Natural Resources headquarters in the state capital. He leveraged his 20-year reputation as an uncompromising agricultural litigator to force the Enforcement Division director to read the university survey right then and there. The state regulators recognized a massive public health crisis when they saw certified university data. They did not hesitate. The DNR director signed the injunction at 3 o'clock that afternoon. The trap was loaded, primed, and ready to detonate. Friday morning arrived. The closing meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock at the law offices of Gregson and Vance downtown. I wore a dark charcoal suit I had bought from a thrift store and had tailored specifically for this morning. I met Gabriel in the parking garage of the polished glass building. We bypassed the receptionist desk entirely. We did not ask for permission. We walked down the thick carpeted corridor toward the main conference room. The air conditioning hummed, smelling of expensive coffee and ozone. Through the transparent glass walls of the conference room, I saw the players assembled around the massive mahogany table. My father sat at the head of the table, projecting the aura of a successful executive closing a legacy deal. My mother sat beside him, casually reviewing a glossy brochure featuring floor plans for luxury condominiums in Naples. Julian was there, too, wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my annual salary. He looked incredibly smug, leaning back in his chair and spinning the keys to the vintage Porsche on his finger. Across the woods sat Blake, the regional acquisitions director for Agrier Solutions, accompanied by 2 silent corporate attorneys with open briefcases. Gregson stood near a digital projector, organizing a thick stack of finalized transfer deeds. The atmosphere inside the room was relaxed, triumphant, and wealthy. They were minutes away from a $4.5 million wire transfer. Gabriel pushed the heavy double doors open without knocking. The conversation stopped abruptly. 6 pairs of eyes snapped toward the entryway. The visual intrusion shattered the comfortable corporate rhythm of the room. My mother gasped softly, her hand dropping the Florida brochure. My father stood up instantly. The relaxed executive vanished, replaced by a man bristling with defensive rage. He pointed a trembling finger at the door. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded. He looked at Gregson. "Call building security immediately. Have them escorted out. This is a closed commercial session, and they are trespassing." Julian scoffed, slamming his hands on the table. "Are you kidding me, Carter? You show up here now? You lost. The county is throwing you out of that rotting shack today. Go back to pouring coffee and let us handle the inheritance." I did not raise my voice. I did not match their aggressive posture. I walked slowly to the edge of the mahogany table, keeping my posture rigid. I looked directly at Blake, ignoring my family entirely. As the sole managing director of the holding company possessing the primary access easements to the property currently under negotiation, I am a required stakeholder in this transaction, I stated clearly. Blake frowned. The corporate executive recalled the survey discrepancy from his previous meeting. He looked at my father, his eyes narrowing. "Richard, you assured me the holding company issue was resolved." My father squared his shoulders, attempting to project absolute control. "It is a non-issue, Blake. The geographical anchor for his supposed water rights is a condemned structure. The county issued the eviction notice. The municipality is voiding his claim as we speak." My father shot me a look of pure venom. My son's extortion attempt failed, and he is just embarrassing himself in front of serious people. Gabriel stepped forward. He did not yell. He operated with lethal clinical efficiency. He opened his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents bound by a heavy metal clip. The top page featured the bright, embossed seal of the State Department of Natural Resources. Gabriel dropped the stack onto the center of the mahogany table. The heavy thud echoed sharply against the glass walls. "Municipal zoning boards do not possess the jurisdiction to override state-level environmental mandates," Gabriel said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. He looked directly at Blake. "I filed an emergency injunction with the DNR director yesterday afternoon." Gabriel slid the Certified University Geological Survey across the polished wood, stopping it exactly 1 inch from Blake's hands. "The soil data confirms the 800 acres sit atop a highly permeable section of the regional aquifer," Gabriel explained, his tone utterly devoid of sympathy. "If Agrier Solutions applies your standard volume of synthetic nitrogen and deep-tilling machinery, the toxic runoff will breach the drinking water supply for 20,000 residents within 7 years. My father's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. He slammed his palm against the table. "That data is fabricated. It's a desperate, fraudulent delay tactic. Gregson, draft an immediate countermotion to strike that filing." Gregson picked up the paperwork. He adjusted his glasses and read the state seal, the authorized signatures, and the university certification stamps. The color drained completely from the probate lawyer's face. He looked at my father and slowly, silently shook his head. He recognized a bulletproof legal execution when he saw one. Gabriel leaned over the table, bracing his hands against the wood. He delivered the fatal blow. "The DNR injunction is currently active," Gabriel informed the Agrier executives. "The state has placed a non-negotiable freeze on the entire property. If Agrier proceeds with this purchase today, the moment your corporation acquires the deed, you assume total liability for the impending environmental catastrophe. If a single commercial tractor turns that soil, I will personally file a class action lawsuit on behalf of 3 municipalities that will freeze your regional operations for a decade and cost your shareholders tens of millions of dollars in punitive damages." Gabriel stared dead into Blake's eyes. "Tell me, Blake, is purchasing a massive toxic liability a sound corporate investment for your board?" The silence that followed was deafening. It was thick, heavy, and suffocating. My mother stared at the state injunction, her hands trembling violently. The reality of the situation breached her walls of denial. The luxury Florida retirement, the country club status, the massive college fund they had drained for Julian, the millions of dollars they were about to receive. It was all evaporating into thin air right in front of her eyes. My father stood frozen at the head of the table. His jaw worked silently, but no words came out. The local judges, the municipal connections, the brutal eviction threats, they were utterly useless against a state environmental mandate backed by certified university science. He had spent his entire life managing risks and crushing vulnerabilities, but he had failed to anticipate that the son he discarded possessed the grit to build a trap capable of destroying a conglomerate. The delusion shattered. The room no longer belonged to my father. Control shifted entirely to the corporate executive sitting across the table. And that executive was about to demonstrate a level of unsentimental cruelty that my family simply could not comprehend. Blake, the regional acquisitions director, did not panic. He did not raise his voice or argue about municipal zoning laws. He operated within a world governed strictly by risk assessment and shareholder profit margins. He picked up the certified geological survey, scanning the permeability charts and the university stamps with the cold calculation of an actuary reviewing a death certificate. He flipped the page to the DNR injunction and read the signature of the state enforcement director. He understood the mechanical reality of the trap immediately. Blake set the documents back down on the mahogany table. He slowly closed his leather portfolio and snapped the brass locks shut. He turned his attention away from Gabriel and focused entirely on my father. The corporate deference he had shown just minutes earlier vanished, replaced by a sharp, clinical indifference. "Richard, Agrier Solutions does not purchase encumbered assets," Blake stated. "Our profit projections require immediate, unimpeded access to the central irrigation draws and the freedom to implement our standard chemical methodologies. A decade-long environmental freeze renders this acreage a dead zone. The presence of an active state injunction transforms this property from a premium agricultural acquisition into a toxic liability." My father gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He attempted to salvage the crumbling foundation of his legacy deal. "Blake, please. This injunction is a temporary hurdle. I can leverage my contacts in Des Moines. I can challenge the university data. Just place the escrow transfer on a brief hold while I clear this blockade." Blake shook his head. His expression remained entirely neutral. A corporate conglomerate does not waste capital fighting state-level ecological lawsuits over a single parcel of dirt in Iowa. We possess the resources to pivot our investments to regions with compliant municipalities and clean topography. Blake looked at my father and delivered the final verdict. "Effective immediately, Agrier Solutions is formally withdrawing our $4.5 million offer. We are terminating all negotiations regarding this estate." He instructed his two silent attorneys to pack their briefcases. My father stood paralyzed. The humiliation he suffered in that moment was profound. It did not stem from a dramatic, emotional argument with his estranged son. It stemmed from the brutal, unfeeling rejection of the very corporate machine he had worshipped. He had sold out his family legacy, manipulated a probate judge, and attempted to render me homeless just to secure a seat at the corporate table. Now, that same corporation was discarding him like a bad algorithm. The Agrier attorneys stood up, buttoned their jackets, and followed Blake toward the double doors. They walked past me without a second glance. The heavy wooden doors swung shut, sealing my parents inside the glass room with the absolute wreckage of their ambition. My mother let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The polished facade of the country club matriarch fractured entirely. She turned to my father, her voice shrill with raw panic. "Richard, what are we going to do?" she demanded. "How are we going to pay off the commercial loans? The bridge financing we secured against the estate for the Florida down payment? The moving vans are booked." They had structured their entire financial future around a massive wire transfer that no longer existed. Without the Agrier money, the high-interest commercial loans my father had taken out to maintain the illusion of their wealth would default within months. The bank would foreclose on the main farmhouse, seize the farming equipment, and auction off the 800 acres for pennies on the dollar. They were financially ruined. Then, the final pillar of their perfect life collapsed. Julian, the golden child, the son who had received every advantage, every dollar, and every ounce of their affection, stood up. His face was twisted in a mixture of panic and furious disgust. He didn't look at me. He glared directly at his parents. "You told me this deal was bulletproof," Julian hissed at my father. "You told me the trust was funded. I just signed a lease on a new penthouse based on my projected management fees from this sale. You dragged me into this mess, and now I'm tied to a bankrupt estate." "Julian, please, we can figure this out," Helen pleaded, reaching out toward him. Julian swatted her hand away. "Figure it out yourselves. I'm not going down with a sinking ship." He grabbed the keys to the vintage Porsche off the table, turned his back on the parents who had worshipped him, and stormed out of the conference room without looking back. Helen buried her face in her hands and began to sob. It was a terrible, hollow sound. She finally realized the truth. The son she adored cared only about the money they could provide, and the son she discarded was the one holding the keys to their survival. The silence inside the boardroom stretched out, heavy and suffocating. I stood near the edge of the table, watching the devastation unfold. I didn't feel a rush of triumphant joy. I didn't feel the sudden magical closure that Hollywood movies promise when the villain is defeated. I felt a deep, exhausted ache in my bones. I had stopped the corporate destruction of the aquifer, but the victory required me to witness the total destruction of my own family. My father slowly lifted his head. He looked at me across the expanse of polished wood. The arrogance and patronizing superiority were gone, replaced by raw, naked desperation. He realized he possessed zero leverage. He was trapped, bleeding capital and facing imminent bankruptcy. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet room. "Carter," he said, his voice thin and brittle, "what is it going to take to lift the DNR injunction? How much money do you want to walk away and let me salvage a sale to a different buyer?" He expected me to demand a massive financial payout out of spite. He expected me to operate with the same greedy transactional logic that governed his life. He had no idea that my strategy did not involve keeping the farm for myself. I pulled a single sheet of paper from my leather satchel and slid it across the table. I outlined the terms of his surrender. "I will not lift the state injunction to facilitate a sale to another corporate conglomerate," I told him, my voice flat and devoid of sympathy. "I will only release the environmental freeze under a highly specific restricted transfer agreement. You are required to sell the bulk of the agricultural acreage, the fields, the storage silos, and the main farmhouse to the Mud Creek Independent Farming Cooperative." The cooperative was an established coalition of local organic growers who utilized sustainable, shallow-till methods that would never threaten the underlying aquifer. My father scanned the document. His eyes widened in horror when he saw the cooperative's purchase offer. The independent farmers lacked the vast capital reserves of a corporate giant. They were offering $1.2 million for the estate. $1.2 million? My mother choked out. "That barely covers the outstanding commercial debt and the bridge loans. It leaves us with practically nothing. It prevents you from declaring total bankruptcy," I stated coldly. "It clears your debts and offers a very modest safety net. You are no longer negotiating for a lavish retirement in Florida. You are negotiating for basic financial survival." My father slammed his hand against the armrest of his chair. "I won't do it. The land is worth triple that on the open market. I will drag this into civil litigation for a decade before I sell my legacy at a discount to a bunch of local hippies." Gabriel stepped up to the edge of the table, acting as the cold voice of legal reality. "Richard, you possess zero leverage to dictate market value. The property is currently labeled a toxic liability by the state. Civil litigation requires immense capital, which you no longer possess. If the commercial bank forecloses on you next month, the property goes to public auction. The bank will seize everything, and you will be left with crushing deficiency judgments and ruined credit. You have two options. Sign the agreement, clear your debts, and walk away, or let your pride push you into total insolvency." My father stared at the document. The fight drained out of him entirely. He looked like an old, exhausted man. He asked me what I gained from the arrangement. The restricted transfer agreement formally recognizes the autonomy of my holding company, I explained. I demand permanent, unencumbered ownership of the riverfront parcel, the access easements, and the primary water rights. I am immediately placing those assets into an irrevocable ecological conservation trust. Regardless of who owns the surrounding fields in the future, the geographic anchor protecting the municipal aquifer can never be sold, developed, or compromised by industrial agriculture. Grandpa's legacy will remain locked in stone. My father picked up a silver pen from the table. His hand shook violently. He recognized the bitter poetry of the situation. He had attempted to erase me using the legal machinery of probate court, and I had utilized a superior legal architecture to dismantle his empire. He signed his name at the bottom of the page. My mother signed beside him, tears silently tracking down her cheeks. Attorney Gregson witnessed the signatures, affixing his notary seal with a heavy sigh. The transfer was officially binding. The corporate threat was neutralized, and the water supply was secured. I picked up the signed agreement and placed it carefully back into my satchel. I did not offer a comforting goodbye. The emotional bridge between us had burned to ash weeks ago, and neither side possessed the materials to rebuild it. I walked out of the conference room, leaving my parents sitting in the quiet wreckage of their ambition. 1 month after the boardroom collision, the physical reality of the aftermath took shape. I parked my truck on the shoulder of the county highway, a quarter-mile away from the main estate. A cold, gray morning mist hung over the fields. I sat in the cab, the engine idling, watching a small, generic moving van parked in the gravel driveway of the white farmhouse. A crew of hired workers carried heavy cardboard boxes out the front door. I watched them load the heavy oak dining table. I saw them carry out the antique grandfather clock that chimed every hour during my childhood summers. The independent cooperative had purchased the acreage, but they had no use for the residential structure. They planned to convert the farmhouse into an administrative office. My family's history was being packed into boxes and driven away. I didn't drive down the driveway to say goodbye. The boundaries were firmly drawn. My parents' financial reality had contracted severely. The sale to the cooperative generated enough capital to satisfy the commercial bank loans and prevent a foreclosure auction. But the surplus was meager. The luxury retirement in Naples evaporated. They were forced to cancel the moving trucks bound for Florida. Instead, they downsized into a modest, cramped 2-bedroom condominium in a noisy suburb outside of Des Moines. The social humiliation in their affluent circles was a bitter pill. The country club farewell party was quietly canceled. The rumors surrounding the collapsed corporate deal circulated rapidly, painting my father not as a shrewd executive, but as a foolish man who lost his empire to his own arrogance. They blamed me entirely, of course. They viewed my strategy as a targeted, vindictive campaign to destroy their happiness, rather than a necessary defense of the municipal water supply. My mother blocked my phone number. My father sent one final, brief email containing a forwarded copy of the finalized property deed, accompanied by a single sentence instructing me never to contact them again. I accepted the silence. Seeking an apology from people incapable of acknowledging their own greed is a waste of energy. 2 years have passed since I walked out of that downtown law firm. The Iowa seasons turned, burying the fields in winter snow and thawing them into vibrant, green springs. The landscape changed, and so did the structure of my life. The rusted, rotting hunting cabin on the riverfront no longer looks like an abandoned shack. I used a portion of my salary and secured a modest rural development grant to rebuild it. I replaced the sagging roof with durable metal sheeting. I tore out the decaying pine panels and installed heavy, insulated windows that frame the rolling current of the river. A small solar array now hums quietly near the treeline, powering a functional, heated workspace. The interior smells of fresh cedar and ground coffee, rather than damp earth and decay. This cabin now serves as the official headquarters for the Mud Creek Eco Trust. I work directly with the independent farming cooperative. They manage the fields using sustainable techniques. Because I control the foundational water rights through the trust, I dictate the irrigation limits. We operate in a symbiotic partnership. They cultivate the land, and I ensure the aquifer beneath our feet remains pristine. The drinking water for 20,000 residents is completely safe. My grandfather's quiet trap evolved into a permanent, living shield. The social dynamics of the county settled into a new, quieter rhythm. The independent cooperative hired local hands, bought equipment from local vendors, and kept the agricultural revenue circulating within the community instead of funneling it to a distant corporate shareholder board. The red condemnation tag is a distant memory. Last December, I walked down to my mailbox at the end of the dirt road. Inside was a generic holiday card. It featured a printed seasonal greeting and the signatures of my parents in blue ink. There was no personal note, no apology, no return address. It was a hollow gesture, an attempt to ease their own guilt without doing the grueling work of accountability. I looked at the card for exactly 3 seconds. Then, I walked back into the cabin and dropped it straight into the paper shredder. I harbor no active malice toward them. Hate requires an immense output of energy, and I prefer to spend my energy analyzing soil composition and securing grant funding. They simply exist in my past, cordoned off by an impenetrable, iron boundary I patrol every single day. Through the county grapevine, I heard the final casualty report of the Golden Child. Julian's high-flying lifestyle crashed and burned. When the Agrier deal collapsed, the consulting firm he worked for realized he was a liability. He failed to secure his own family's assets, proving he was useless in corporate negotiations. He was quietly let go. Without his massive salary and trust fund, he couldn't afford the penthouse lease. And Samantha, the fiancée who threw away my ring for a promotion, she proved that loyalty bought with money only lasts until the money runs out. When Julian lost his job and the bank repossessed the vintage Porsche, Samantha packed her bags and left him for a regional CEO in Chicago. They deserved exactly what they got from each other. When people hear how I defeated a multi-million-dollar corporate buyout and outmaneuvered my estranged parents, they often assume the aftermath feels like a triumphant cinematic montage. They expect the story to end with a roaring crowd and a perfect resolution. The truth is far more quiet. Real success does not resemble a fiery explosion of revenge. Revenge is a destructive impulse that leaves you standing in a pile of ash. Success is architectural. It requires you to survey the wreckage, pick up the usable scraps your adversaries left behind, and build a structure capable of weathering the next storm. I didn't win this war by screaming in a courtroom or begging my parents to love me. I won by matching their ruthlessness with superior strategy. I survived the humiliation of the diner, the freezing nights, and the crushing isolation because I accepted that independence is not a gift you receive from your family. Independence is a territory you conquer. Raw anger is a severe liability. If you want to defeat a cold, calculating opponent, you must freeze your emotions. Strategy requires a clear mind. Boundaries demand a profound sacrifice. Drawing a line in the sand is easy. Defending that line costs you your comfort. Protecting my grandfather's legacy cost me my relationship with my partner and any illusion of a supportive family. But I learned that biological family guarantees absolutely nothing. We are taught to prioritize blood loyalty above all else. But blood did not keep me warm when I was freezing in a rotting cabin. You are under no obligation to set yourself on fire to keep your relatives warm. Loyalty is an active, earned currency. When people show you they view you as an obstacle rather than a human being, believe them immediately and act accordingly. Today, I own the legal authority to protect my community. I built a life that requires zero permission from the people who tried to discard me. You have the power to do the exact same thing. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I know it was a long journey, but it's one I felt I needed to share. I hope this resonated with you in some way, especially if you've ever had to walk away from people you thought you could trust. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to draw a hard boundary with your own family to protect your future? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one. And finally, if you are still here, listening to my voice at the very end of this video, I have a special request. I want you to comment the letter W below. W stands for winner. It's the secret code for our 1% club. A sign for me to recognize the absolute best part of this community, the people who see things through to the end. It lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone out there. Please don't forget to hit that like button and follow the channel so we can stay connected. Take care of yourselves, protect your boundaries, and I will see you in the next story.
Clean it all up, but appreciate it. I see myself every day, so it's hard for me to see what's going on, but we've been really trying to eat well, weighing myself most days. I was going to do something. Whoop. Boo, 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 boo. But if I see you on the other side, I see you. If not, it was good to hear from you. Good luck in your job search and moving. Thanks for stopping in. Appreciate it. Of a hustler. There you go, get in there. Get the founder role. I don't know the password to one of my email accounts, dude. Join your Discord later. Appreciate it. You'll get the founder role, which I'll put that on, and then here we go. Just joined. Let's get you in there. No, diva is a thing. I'm a hustler. And when it pops, I'll get you the perms. Yeah, you too. Thank you so much. Diva is a thing. Oops. All right, let's get into our workout here, boys. The actual part of our workout. All right. Let's get to... All right. So we're going to do our leg extension to a shoulder press, to a squat, to a shoulder lateral raise. Hopefully some gnarly pumps and we can get this done quicker. Okay. Let's see. It was at 11, I believe. Three. Seven.